Evan had always been a man of precision. A scientist through and through, his life revolved around facts, measurements, and repeatable experiments. His colleagues often described him as methodical, which, in their eyes, was a polite way of saying he was obsessive. But what they didn't understand was that Evan's obsession with antimatter wasn't just a career choice, it was a calling. The kind of call that echoed in the silence of an empty lab, where the only sound was the hum of machines that he'd spent countless hours perfecting. It all began on a Tuesday, as Tuesday mornings often do. The lab was quiet, save for the occasional click of a keyboard or the shuffle of papers on desks. Evan stood before a row of glass containers, each holding different samples of antimatter. It was supposed to be a routine experiment. He had been working on it for years, perfecting the way antimatter could be controlled and stored in a stable state, something that no one had been able to do before. It was his big breakthrough. The idea was simple: if antimatter could be controlled, it could revolutionize everything, from energy production to transportation. But Evan wasn't just thinking about the practical applications. No, he had bigger plans. What if antimatter could be used to fundamentally change biology? What if it could evolve life itself? Today's the day, he muttered under his breath, staring at the containment chamber with an almost religious fervor. A flicker of anticipation ran through his body. He adjusted his glasses, checked the calibration one last time, and pressed the button that would trigger the release of antimatter into the containment field. At first, everything went according to plan. The antimatter was drawn into the field, swirling around in mesmerizing patterns. Evan watched with a sense of pride. But then, the humming sound deepened, growing louder, more intense. The containment field began to flicker. Evan frowned. Something was wrong. Before he could react, a burst of energy surged from the chamber, throwing Evan backward with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. The lab lights flickered, and the machine went into overdrive, spiraling out of control. The antimatter spilled out, swirling around Evan in a glowing vortex. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the energy field that enveloped him. And then, there was an explosion, an implosion, more like it. The antimatter collapsed in on itself, creating a brilliant flash of light so bright that it burned into Evan's retinas. His body absorbed the energy, felt it course through him, reshaping him on a fundamental level. When Evan opened his eyes again, the lab was in shambles. The machines were shattered, the containment fields gone. He was lying on the cold floor, his body aching. He tried to stand up, but something felt different. His skin, his entire body, tingled. There was an odd weight to him, a lightness and heaviness all at once. He staggered to his feet and stumbled to the nearest mirror. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. His once ordinary reflection was gone. In its place stood a man who looked nothing like himself. His skin shimmered with an iridescent glow, faint but undeniable. His eyes, once a dull brown, now shimmered with an unnatural blue light. His muscles were more defined, his posture taller, more regal. What the hell? Evan muttered, his voice sounding unfamiliar in his own ears. He reached up to touch his face, and his hand brushed against the smooth, almost metallic surface of his skin. It was like nothing he had ever experienced. His heart raced. Was he changing? Evolving? His mind raced faster than his body could follow. He looked around the lab. The explosion had left a trail of destruction. But what had happened to him? Was this some kind of mutation? No. That wasn't possible. He had been exposed to antimatter, but he had carefully monitored the experiment. This couldn't have been the result. Then he noticed something even stranger: his hands. They weren't just glowing. They were warping, twisting, turning into something else. He clenched his fist, and a wave of energy rippled through the air, knocking several books and papers off the nearby shelves. His breath caught in his throat. He was no longer just a man. He was something else entirely. As he stood in the wreckage of his once pristine lab, Evan had two thoughts. The first was that he needed to get out of here before anyone found out about this disaster. The second was that he had no idea what the hell was happening to him. He didn't know how long he spent in the lab, but when he finally left, it was under the cover of darkness. The world outside was quiet, the city streets empty. Evan walked the familiar paths of his neighborhood, but everything felt different. People stared at him as he passed, though he couldn't figure out why. Was it his glowing skin? His eyes? The way he now carried himself, his mind was a swirl of thoughts. He was becoming something else. His very biology was rewriting itself, evolving at a pace he couldn't control. He was changing. And worse, he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The next few days were a blur. Evan locked himself in his apartment, refusing to leave. He couldn't bear to face the outside world, not until he figured out what was happening to him. But the changes kept coming, more profound, more intense. His strength grew. His senses sharpened. He felt alive in ways he had never experienced before. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something had gone terribly wrong, yet somehow, it felt right. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the city, a new movement was rising. They were the outcasts, the mutants, people who had been exposed to antimatter in ways no one had ever expected. Some had survived the exposure, others not so much. Their bodies were twisted, scarred, their minds often broken. But among them, there was a new sense of unity. They were no longer just victims of fate, they were something more. And they had a leader, a woman named Sylvia. Sylvia had been part of a secret government experiment, one that had exposed her to the unstable effects of antimatter. But unlike most others, she hadn't just survived. She had thrived. Her body had mutated, evolved. Her powers had grown, and with them, her desire for justice. She had witnessed the horrors of the world's prejudice against those who were different, and now, she wanted to do something about it. Evan had become her obsession. She had heard rumors of a man who had undergone the same transformation she had, someone who was even more powerful than she could imagine. She saw in him the key to leading the mutants to their rightful place in society. The only problem was, she had no idea where Evan was. But she would find him. She had to. Back in his apartment, Evan was growing desperate. His body was changing faster than he could control, and his mind was racing with questions he couldn't answer. What had happened to him? Was he going to die? Or had he somehow evolved into something greater? It was late one evening when the knock came at his door. Evan froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. But the knock came again, this time more insistent. Slowly, hesitantly, he made his way to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway was Sylvia, her hair a brilliant cascade of silver, her eyes glowing with the same intensity as his. She smiled at him, a smile that was both comforting and unnerving. "You're not alone anymore, Evan," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." Evan stared at Sylvia for a moment, unsure of what to make of her. She was too calm, too composed, her presence almost unsettling in its serenity. His own thoughts were a hurricane of confusion, his body trembling with strange, uncontrolled energy. The door between them felt like a fragile barrier, one that could crumble under the weight of everything that was happening to him. "I don't know what's happening to me," Evan said, his voice strained. He tried to make sense of the surge of emotions and sensations that had been building up inside him. You look like me. But, how do you know what's going on? How can you possibly know what's happening?" Sylvia stepped forward, her gaze softening with understanding. "I know exactly what's happening to you. I've seen it before. We are part of something much larger, Evan. You're not just some freak accident of science. You're part of a new evolution, one that goes beyond humanity as it exists now. And I need you to understand, this transformation, this change, is the future." Evan felt his throat tighten. Her words hung in the air like a prophecy, unsettling yet strangely compelling. He wasn't ready to believe it, not yet, but the truth was, he didn't know what else to believe. What other explanation could there be for the impossible transformation he had undergone? "I'm not ready for this," Evan murmured, more to himself than to her. His fingers twitched, and he involuntarily sent a ripple of energy through the floorboards, causing them to groan in protest. "I can't even control it. I don't know how to control it. What if I hurt someone?" "You won't," Sylvia replied firmly, her voice steady. She took a small step closer, her presence both comforting and insistent. "You just have to understand your power. It's not about control in the way you think. It's about harnessing it, channeling it. You are the first of a new species, Evan. A species that will change everything." Her words echoed in his mind, but he felt only dread. A new species. That was the last thing he ever imagined he'd be a part of. All his life, he had been a scientist, a man who measured the world in terms of data and probability. This was chaos. This was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "You think this is going to fix the world?" he asked bitterly, shaking his head. "You think a new species is going to solve anything? We're already divided as it is. What's one more group of people that don't fit into the system?" "It's not about fixing the world, Evan," Sylvia said quietly, a fire in her eyes that wasn't there before. "It's about giving the world a new chance. You'll see. The people who are scared of you, who are scared of us, they'll have no choice but to accept us. Because we are the future." Before he could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. Evan's heart skipped. Who else could be coming after him now? Had Sylvia brought more people with her? He wasn't sure he was ready to meet anyone else who might be, like her. Like him. Sylvia held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. She stepped toward the door, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she slowly turned the knob and opened it, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the hallway, his face obscured by a dark hood. "Is he here?" the man's voice rumbled, low and thick with authority. Sylvia's eyes narrowed. "He's here." The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and Evan instinctively took a step back. There was something about him that radiated power, an energy so intense it felt like the air in the room had thickened. He couldn't explain it, but it was as though this man had been touched by the same force that had altered him, changed him. "Evan," the man said, his gaze locking onto him. "You've been hiding long enough. It's time to stop running. You're needed." Evan stared at the man, heart racing. "Needed for what?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm not ready for any of this. I can't lead anyone. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with myself." "You don't have to lead anyone yet," the man said, a slight grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But whether you like it or not, you are the beginning of something much bigger than you or me. Than any of us. And there are others out there who need you to help them understand what's happening to them, too." Evan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe it. There were others? People like him? Were they all as lost and confused as he was? Or worse, were they more dangerous? Were they capable of controlling what was happening to them? "They're scared, Evan," Sylvia added softly. "Just like you are. But together, we can help them. We can help each other. And in time, we can build something stronger. Something that doesn't have to hide anymore." Evan closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. He wanted to believe her, to trust that he wasn't completely alone in this strange new world. But it was hard to take that first step into the unknown, to embrace something he hadn't chosen, hadn't asked for. "What if I can't control it?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I lose myself in all of this?" Sylvia stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You won't. Because you're stronger than you think. We all are. But you have to stop hiding. You have to stop being afraid. Evan looked at her, and for the first time since his transformation began, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the need for something, anything, that could make sense of what he was going through. I'm not ready for all of this, Evan repeated. But I don't think I have a choice anymore, do I? Sylvia's smile was knowing, almost sympathetic. No. You don't. But that doesn't mean you're alone in this, Evan. We're with you. Days passed in a blur, each one more surreal than the last. Evan found himself at the center of something he couldn't quite understand. He had left his apartment, no longer feeling safe within its walls. Instead, he had been taken to an underground hideout, a place where the mutants like Sylvia could gather without fear of being hunted down. They called themselves the Changed. Some were still adjusting to their new powers, struggling to control the strange abilities that had manifested in their bodies. Others had adapted more easily, their forms twisted into strange, almost unrecognizable shapes. There was a man with glowing, translucent skin, his veins pulsating with strange, shifting colors. A woman who could phase through solid matter, vanishing and reappearing in the blink of an eye. There were more, too many to count, and every one of them had their own story. Evan wasn't sure what to think of them. Some of them seemed eager, driven by the hope that Sylvia and the others could lead them to a new life. But there was also a palpable sense of fear, of uncertainty. They had all been rejected by the world they once knew, and Evan was no different. He had lost everything, his job, his place in the world, the life he had carefully built, but there was something else here. Something that stirred deep within him, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. A sense of belonging. Are you ready? Sylvia asked one morning as Evan sat by a table, his hands resting nervously on the surface. Evan glanced up at her, then looked around the room at the faces of those who had gathered. They were all waiting for him to lead them. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. I'm ready, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he truly was. Sylvia smiled, a glint of pride in her eyes. Good. Let's go. We have a lot of work to do. Evan stepped out into the street, the air outside thick with the scent of rain. It had rained earlier in the morning, and the wet pavement gleamed beneath the dim light of the street lamps. For a moment, everything felt ordinary again, just another night in a world that was now slipping farther and farther from his understanding. But that feeling passed quickly as he glanced at Sylvia, walking beside him, her face unreadable. The weight of the unknown had never felt so heavy. They moved quickly, heading deeper into the city's forgotten neighborhoods. The hideout wasn't far, but the streets were unfamiliar now, even though they were once places Evan knew well. The city had always been a concrete jungle, full of noise and movement, but tonight it felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. A storm that Evan could feel swirling around him, gathering energy with each step he took. The other members of the Changed had scattered into the shadows, slipping through alleyways and blending into the crowd. They were heading toward an abandoned warehouse near the edge of the city, a place that had once served as a factory before it was left to rot. It was the perfect location, hidden and secure. And, Evan thought, it was exactly the kind of place that reflected their lives now, forgotten, discarded, and barely holding on, but there was power in that. Power in being forgotten, in being underestimated. And that was something Evan had never understood until now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, something he had created during his early experiments with antimatter. It was meant to monitor his own biological changes, a way to track how his body was adapting to the new forces coursing through him. But the device hadn't worked as expected. At first, it had simply recorded the changes, documenting the transformations in neat rows of data. Now, it was just a reminder of how far things had gone beyond science, beyond anything Evan had ever imagined. Are you all right? Sylvia's voice broke through his thoughts. She was looking at him closely, her expression soft yet knowing. Evan glanced up at her, trying to push the discomfort down. I'm fine. Just thinking. About what? She asked, her voice low, almost inviting him to confide in her. He paused for a moment before responding. How everything has changed. I've always been in control, you know? Or at least I thought I was. But now I don't even know what's real anymore. Sylvia nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of her own experiences. It's terrifying, isn't it? To lose that control. But it's also freeing. You're not bound by the same rules as everyone else anymore. You're beyond them. I don't know if I want to be beyond them, Evan muttered under his breath. But the truth was, a part of him already knew the answer. He was beyond them, whether he liked it or not. And now, he had to figure out what to do with that. They reached the warehouse, and Sylvia pushed open the rusted door. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the dim light barely illuminated the old wooden beams that crisscrossed above. The place was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made Evan's skin crawl. It was here that the leaders of the Changed had gathered, and it was here that Evan would meet them, people whose lives had been shattered by the same forces that had altered him. He didn't know what to expect. The city had long since turned its back on those like him. The mutants. The outcasts. The ones who had been touched by antimatter, their bodies twisted and broken in ways that couldn't be ignored. Inside, the room was dimly lit by flickering candles and makeshift lamps. A few figures sat at a long table, their eyes watching Evan as he entered. He could feel their gaze like heat on his skin, and for a moment, he wanted to turn and leave. But he didn't. He couldn't point. One of the figures stood up as he entered, a woman with sharp features and eyes that burned with an intensity that matched Sylvia's. Her hair was shaved close to her scalp, and her body was covered in tattoos, symbols that Evan couldn't quite decipher. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. Evan, she said, her voice smooth but hard. I've heard about you. You've been hiding long enough. Evan swallowed, feeling an uncomfortable heat rise to his face. I wasn't hiding, he said quickly. I just didn't know what was happening to me. She smiled, a grin that was more dangerous than friendly. The same thing that's happening to all of us. You're not special, Evan. You just got lucky. And now, you're here. Now you can help us. Evan opened his mouth to protest, but Sylvia stepped in, holding up her hand. Let me speak with him first, Carla. He's not ready for the pitch just yet. Carla didn't look happy, but she nodded and stepped back. Sylvia led Evan further into the room, where a few others stood, watching him closely. Are they always this intense? Evan asked, his voice low. They're scared, Sylvia replied, her tone softer now. Scared of what's coming. But they're also determined. And they need someone to lead them, to show them what they're capable of. Evan didn't know what to say to that. He didn't feel like a leader. He barely even felt like a man anymore. He felt like a ticking time bomb, one wrong step away from losing control completely. You've got more power than you know, Evan, Sylvia continued, her voice calm and steady. And you can either hide from it, or you can use it. But you have to decide, and you have to decide now. Evan looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who watched him silently. They were waiting for him. Waiting for him to step up, to take charge. He felt his body tingle again, the strange, unfamiliar energy pulsing beneath his skin. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. But he knew one thing for sure, the world wasn't going to wait for him to figure it out. He was already a part of something bigger than he could understand. I'm in, Evan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Sylvia nodded. Good. Because we don't have time to waste. Over the following weeks, Evan began to learn what it meant to be part of this new world. He trained with the others, learning how to control his powers, or at least how to keep them from destroying everything in his path. The others were just as much in the dark as he was, but together, they were beginning to form something resembling a plan. A plan to take back the city. To show the world what they were capable of. But not everyone was ready for that. Not everyone believed they had the right to take control of their fate. Some were still hiding, still afraid of what the world would do if they came out of the shadows. And then there were those who wanted to destroy everything, to tear down the old world completely and start anew. Evan was caught in the middle of it all. He was the one who had to decide which path to take. The pressure weighed heavily on him, and the longer he spent with the changed, the more he realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that they belonged. Proving that they were more than the label society had given them. One night, as he sat alone in the quiet of the hideout, Sylvia came to find him. She sat down beside him, her presence steady and calming. "We're doing well," she said, her voice gentle but with a firmness that he knew she didn't reserve for just anyone. "Better than I expected, actually. But there's still more to do. More to understand." "I don't know if I can do this," Evan admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can lead them. I don't know if I can even control what's inside me." "You're not alone," Sylvia said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're all in this together. And you're stronger than you think." Evan nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready. But what other choice did he have? The following days blurred into each other, each one a mixture of intense training and quiet moments of reflection. Evan still wasn't sure whether he was more terrified or exhilarated by the changes inside him. The powers were growing stronger, more volatile, but with every experiment, every training session, he felt a tiny bit more in control. Just enough to convince himself he wasn't about to destroy everything. Not yet, anyway. He spent long hours in the warehouse, working with the others, learning how they controlled their abilities, or in some cases, failed to. Sylvia led the group with a fierce determination, never once showing doubt, but Evan could sense her exhaustion. She was as much a part of this movement as anyone, but he could see the toll it was taking. The weight of their cause, the fear that they might not be enough, was written on her face in the way she spoke, in the way she looked over her shoulder when they gathered in the dark. Evan couldn't deny that he was starting to see the appeal of this rebellion, of the chance to right the wrongs of the world. But every time he thought about it, a flicker of doubt crept in. Were they ready for this fight? Was he ready to lead? One afternoon, Sylvia called a meeting. It was the first time they would sit down together as a unit, formally. No more scattered whispers, no more hesitant glances. This was a moment to decide who they were going to be. To decide whether they would continue to hide in the shadows or step into the light and show the world who they were. Evan was seated near the back of the room. The others were gathered around the long wooden table, their eyes on Sylvia. She stood at the front, her posture unwavering. As she began to speak, "We've all been waiting for the right moment. We've been hiding long enough, waiting for the world to give us a chance, but it's clear now that waiting will get us nowhere. They won't change. Not for us. We're the ones who have to change things." Her eyes swept across the room, catching every gaze, every face. Evan's heart beat a little faster as her words sank in. "We can't let fear keep us from claiming what's ours," Sylvia continued. "The world doesn't have to accept us, but we're done asking for permission. We have the power to take what's ours. To show them that we're not freaks, not monsters, not mistakes. We're evolution. And we will not be silenced." The room was still. The tension was palpable. Evan could feel the weight of the moment pressing in, heavy and uncertain. "So, the question is simple," Sylvia said, her voice steady and strong. "Are we ready to take this to the next level? Are we ready to show them what we're capable of?" Evan stood up, his legs unsteady for a moment, the pulsing energy inside him almost unbearable. He had never been one to speak in front of crowds, to make grand speeches or declarations. But this wasn't just a speech. This was his future, his choice. "I'm ready," Evan said, his voice louder than he expected. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he felt a strange certainty in his words, as though they had been building up inside him for longer than he realized. Sylvia's eyes met his, a flicker of approval in her gaze. Good. Then it's time we make our move. That night, they put their plan into motion. The streets of the city were deserted as they moved through the shadows. The others had gathered at the perimeter, waiting for the signal. Evan could feel the tension in the air, the electricity that surged through the streets as the movement finally began to take shape. The city, once a symbol of the world's indifference, was now the battlefield where they would make their stand. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as they neared the government building, the heart of the power that had kept them hidden, that had labeled them as freaks. It was the one place in the city that held the key to everything. The law, the enforcement, the powers that had kept the changed on the fringes of society. Tonight, they would tear that power down. As they approached, Sylvia gave a signal, and the others dispersed, slipping into the shadows with remarkable speed and silence. Evan was at the center of it all, his body humming with energy, every nerve alive. He could feel the pulsing force inside him, pushing at the boundaries of what he thought was possible. It was as if his body had finally become a conduit for something much larger, something that existed beyond the limits of mere flesh. Evan raised his hand, and a ripple of antimatter surged from his fingertips. He focused, channeling it carefully, and watched as the energy tore through the walls of the government building, creating a path into the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The others followed, moving quickly and efficiently, their own powers complementing his in ways that seemed almost instinctual. Inside, the hallways were dark, but Evan's enhanced senses allowed him to navigate with ease. His eyes burned with an unnatural brightness, allowing him to see through the shadows as though it were daylight. He could hear the faint scuffle of boots, the murmur of voices approaching, but none of that deterred him. They had come too far. They had no choice now but to move forward. They reached the central control room, where the heart of the city's power was stored, an enormous, high-tech facility filled with screens and monitors, where government officials pulled the strings, controlling every aspect of the city's resources. The room was full of armed guards, but they were no match for the mutants. The first blast of energy from one of the group's members sent them scattering, leaving the room open for Sylvia to step inside, her eyes flashing with determination. Evan followed closely, his breath coming in shallow bursts. It felt like they were at the precipice of something monumental, something that would change everything. But he couldn't stop thinking about what this would cost. What would they sacrifice to bring down the system? What if they were wrong? But there was no time for doubt. Sylvia was already at the central console, her fingers flying over the keys as she hacked into the system, overriding the security protocols. The alarms began to blare, but it didn't matter now. The countdown had begun, and there was no going back. Evan, Sylvia said, turning to him with a look that was equal parts fierce and weary. This is it. We've got one shot at this. Are you ready? He looked around at the faces of the others, their eyes filled with hope and desperation, their bodies thrumming with the energy of their evolution. He didn't know what would happen after tonight, but for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel afraid. He felt alive. Like he was exactly where he was meant to be. I'm ready, he said, the words coming out stronger than he felt. He could feel the energy building inside him, and he channeled it with everything he had, and then, with a single motion, they brought the system to its knees. The building shook, lights flickering as the central power grid shut down. In that moment, it felt as if the entire city had paused, holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Evan stood amidst the chaos, the weight of their actions settling over him. There was no turning back now. The world had changed, and they had changed with it. They had stepped into the light, and this was only the beginning.